Who are the ones to blame for the way history is told today? There's a phrase, almost a cliche, that says history is written by the winners, it's written by those who win. In this case, that's not true. The history of Spain has been written by the losers, by those who are now trying to win through legislation what they couldn't win back then. This is a Civil War style speech, and I'll be heavily criticized for it, but it's the truth.
To fight against that idea, which is completely detached from reality, that the Second Republic was this place where we all lived together in peace and some evil fascists decided to destroy it.
Well, it's because the left is sectarian, hiding behind a false sense of coexistence. I think that's what most sets today's woke left apart from the conservative right. The conservative right, though often called totalitarian, can coexist with those who think differently. However, the left has sought to destroy the individual, which contributes to today's cancel culture. The main difference between the censorship that existed in other times and the censorship that exists today is that today, the goal is not to confront arguments or ideas, but to destroy the person. It's really a representation of that attitude. It's in the left's DNA to destroy rather than coexist with those who think differently. The government, which often talks about not polarizing or claims that they only respond to protests or attacks from their opponents, actually funds YouTubers to run their social media campaigns.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, bears and she-bears. Good evening, boars and sows. Welcome to another episode of La Factoria. Today I have the great pleasure of having RUBÉN 100 with me. Many of you will know him for his meteoric and very short career on Instagram. Others will know him from the historic debate we had on Red Pill podcast. So, RUBÉN, how are you? How are you doing? It's a pleasure to have you here.
How are you, Jota? Thanks, the pleasure's mine.
There were a lot of topics left out in the debate we had with Anuj and Politoloco. And by the way, I want to give some recognition here, specifically to Politoloco, for being honest and acknowledging that what the guys from Woke of News did was a blatant manipulation.
Well, that was really something.
Remember, I warned you about them?
Yeah, you warned me because of a previous problem, that's right.
What they did to me was even worse.
No, what you said was almost prophetic. They did it again during the debate. Incredible.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think the left, let's start with the Woke of News people, why instead of attacking our arguments, since we're obviously people who are very critical of the democratic system, instead of attacking universal suffrage or our view of universal suffrage, why do you think the left feels the need to manipulate everything to make us look bad?
The left is sectarian, masking it as coexistence. That mainly sets the woke left apart from the conservative right. Although many call us totalitarian, I believe the conservative right can coexist with those who think differently. However, the left has targeted individuals for destruction, which is part of today's cancel culture. The main difference between the censorship that existed in other times and the censorship that exists today is that today, the goal is not to confront arguments or ideas, but to destroy the person. A clear example is what happened with J.K. Rowling. You might recall when some allegedly transphobic tweets were attributed to her. During the rush to cancel Rowling, people didn't question the quality or writing of the Harry Potter books. Only the author herself was questioned. And what this shows is that we are living in a time where the most sectarian and rabid wing of the left is prevailing in the Spanish parliamentary system. They don't want to coexist with those who think differently, they aim to destroy. This has always been part of their historical DNA. We can discuss this later if you want, but during the Civil War, the left was more totalitarian than history suggests. It's really a representation of that DNA, that gene the left has always had, to destroy rather than coexist with those who think differently.
I would like to get into that DNA. I would like to talk about that DNA before talking about technocracy, before talking about a lot of other things to discuss, about crime, about treason, and a lot of things that you and I have to talk about. But let's talk about the DNA of the left, and above all, I also wanted to ask you, is this way of manipulating things to convince your own people that the other side is evil exclusive to the left?
Well, no, manipulation, let's see, I think it's something that really belongs to, it's very much a part of 21st century culture. Cancel culture brings about a culture war that, by the way, many people deny, but I assume we live in it, and in that culture war, it seems like a playing field has been established where there are no limits. There are no limits to attacking your opponent. There's civil destruction. Some cross boundaries, while others respect them more. But in reality, those boundaries don't exist, which is why we see the government, which often says it avoids polarization, or only responds to protests or attacks from opponents. What they actually do is fund YouTubers to run their social media campaigns. This is part of the culture war. I understand manipulation happens on both sides, and I don't think my speech has been black and white. That's why it's important to have people who respect boundaries so we can understand each other and address arguments. The left has always acted this way. For example, during the Second Republic, they felt they owned it and never discussed a Second Republic where others could govern. So when Alejandro Lerroux won the elections, they staged the coup d'etat against the Republic. This is part of the intrinsic DNA of the left. So I think what we need to do is look for people who actually respect those boundaries, who allow us to coexist in the face of the civil destruction that others are trying to cause. And from there, well, select people from the left who have at least a minimum of dignity. You think? I think it's a matter of dignity, of respecting. Hey, you have your ideas, I have mine. And we can understand each other if we start to debate, even if we're forceful. But what I will never do is go after you personally. First, if I don't know you, I have no reason to attack you personally. Second, the culture war should remain about ideas, not get personal. So, well, there are people on the left who understand this, there are people on the right who understand this, and there is manipulation on both sides. Of course there is.
So, you associate that DNA with the Second Republic. Even back in the Second Republic, they were already trying to destroy the individual, trying to destroy society, trying to impose themselves no matter the cost.
Yes, just look at statements from Francisco Largo Caballero, leader of the Socialist Party during the so-called tolerant and free Second Republic. Francisco Largo Caballero once said in a 1934 speech in Geneva, "I am not a Democrat. I don't believe in freedom." He was known for such statements. This was a leader of the Socialist Party, which today presents itself as defending the values of democracy and freedom. Francisco Largo Caballero went so far as to say that if the right wing won, a civil war had to be started. And indeed he did, because actually, well, the date that historiography has set for the start of the Second Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, is July 18, 1936. Well, I want to reflect on something. I think it's a debate we should have. Did the Civil War in Spain really start on July 18, 1936? Well, if we assume that this is the case, we would have to assume that what existed before that civil war was a democracy. Because the civil war is the starting point between this democracy, that was the Second Republic, and what came after, which I repeat, for the majority of historians, is considered a dictatorship. If what existed before was a democracy, we would have to ask ourselves in which other democracies an armed revolution was started, instigated by a political party, that led to the death of 1,500 people, because that's what the Socialist Party did. Francisco Largo Caballero and Indalecio Prieto, leaders of the Socialist Party, together with the anarchists, started a revolution in October 1934 in Asturias, also in Catalonia, but mainly in Asturias, in which 1,500 people died. If July 18, 1936 is the beginning of the Second Civil War, we have to assume that on July 13, which is 5 days earlier, we were not at war yet. In what country that is at peace, in a supposed democracy, does the bodyguard of a political leader assassinate the opponent? Because that's what Indalecio Prieto's bodyguard did to José Calvo Sotelo, an opponent of the regime. So Spanish society was already very polarized long before the start of the Civil War. That's one of the reasons why the uprising led to the Civil War. Not every military uprising leads to a civil war. Miguel Primo de Rivera's uprising had the support of the monarchy. Why? Because there was a society that was completely united to bring about a change to a Bourbon monarchy that was seen as having no reason to continue, and that's why it didn't lead to a civil war. So yes, I think it's a debate that should be reopened in historiography.
That's very interesting because it's true. Not every military uprising leads to war. That one did.
Exactly.
Why?
Because society was completely polarized. I mean, there were, let's see, the causes that led to the start of the Civil War could give us enough material for another podcast to talk about, right? There was an industrial problem. While the rest of the European powers had already begun a process of rebuilding that consisted of industrializing their nations at the beginning of the 20th century in Spain, we were still a country of plows. There were agrarian issues, including 2 harsh confiscations a century earlier in the 19th century, leading to very unfair land distribution, right? And then the Second Republic that not only doesn't fix those problems, but makes them worse too, right? Exactly. As you said, not every uprising or military coup necessarily has to lead to a civil war. Miguel Primo de Rivera's military uprising is a successful example that didn't cause a civil war. An example of a military uprising that doesn't lead to a civil war and isn't successful is Tejero's February 23rd coup attempt, right? What happened there is that the population was united, but against that uprising. That's why there was no prior polarization, and that's why there was no outbreak of civil war. The outbreak of the Civil War on July 18, 1936 is the result of a society that was already killing each other before that outbreak began, right? So, yes, and that's the problem with history, isn't it? What history does, through the historical memory law and through the democratic memory law of 2022, which reforms that historical memory law of 2007, is to hide that part of history. That's why, in the democratic memory law, only those who died between 1936 and 1975 are recognized. And what they want to tell us with this is that it doesn't matter what happened between 1931 and 1936. The tens of thousands of people who died in the secret prisons don't matter, nor do the people who died, for example, at the hands of the Red Terror, which was an absolutely sectarian movement. They were not seeking coexistence, but to destroy those who preached the word of God, like priests and nuns.
One of the things, Ruben, that I wanted to talk to you about is the endemic evil of Spanish society, which in my view is the following: having opinions that are completely disconnected from reality. I respect that everyone can have their own opinion. What do you think about that light? Is it good? Is it warm? Is it cold? You can debate all that, but you can't deny it's a light. And making the analogy of light with respect to the Second Republic, the other day I went to a left-wing account that talked about the uprising and referred to it as an uprising against a democratic, peaceful, let's say utopian situation in which the Republic found itself. And that's where I ask myself, how can we, without being sectarian and without falling into the same mistakes as the other side, because obviously atrocities were also committed by the other side, fight against that idea, which is totally far from reality, that the Second Republic was this place where we all lived together in peace and some evil fascist decided to destroy it?
It's very complicated, and I think it's part of what we conservatives have to contribute in the culture war. This is rooted in the Second Republic, and I think we must first identify the culprits. Who is to blame for the way history is told today? There's a phrase, almost a cliche, that says history is written by the winners, by those who win. No, in this case, that's not true. The history of Spain has been written by the losers, by those who are trying to win today through legislation what they couldn't win back then. This is a very civil war-driven political narrative. I know I'm going to be criticized a lot for this, but it's the reality. As you said, to fight the cultural battle, we can't deny reality. So, who is responsible for us having to constantly push back against a narrative the left has already won? Well, look, Mrs. Cayetana Alvarez de Toledo, who is a member of parliament for the People's Party, talks about how we are living in the era of the inverted board, right? She says the left always sets the foundation first, and then the right comes along, head down, forced to accept what the left has established. I don't know Mrs. Cayetana Alvarez de Toledo personally, or had the chance to tell her this, but I'd like to say the board is inverted because while some Socialist Party members turned it, People's Party members just watched them do it. Here there is action from the Socialist Party and inaction by the People's Party. Look, the first person to reopen the Civil War issue in this period of democracy was José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero. From the time of José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero until today, we have had Mariano Rajoy and we have had Pedro Sánchez. And they have been presidents who have only continued to magnify this problem we have today with the Civil War. A problem that, by the way, seemed to have already been overcome in Spain. Because we had all accepted, well, with better or worse opinions about what the Civil War was, with better or worse opinions about what the Second Republic was, with better or worse opinions about what Franco's regime was, but we had all accepted that it was part of our past. The past should lay the foundation for the present, not cause conflict today. Still, these governments have completely undermined that idea. What they have done is try to destroy a common past that we had already overcome as a nation. And that's why today, many of the problems we have in 21st century society can be explained because they are directly rooted in the history of the Civil War. So, what we have to do is actually point out those responsible. The Socialist Party is responsible by commission, and the Popular Party by omission.
Why does the Popular Party act by omission? I mean, I think we're talking about the absolute majority that Mariano Rajoy obtained. He said he was going to change these laws, that he was going to take the fight to them, that he was going to say, hey, okay, let's make a democratic memory law, but with everything. And he backed out, they backed out. What do you think is the reason for this omission by what people call the right, which for me is not right-wing at all?
No, they're both centrist parties. I support the PPSOE argument. In the European Parliament, they agree on over 80% of decisions together. This means the real difference between choosing the Popular Party or the Socialist Party for the European Parliament is, at most, 20% objectively speaking. Well, look, I think it's mainly because the left, historically, has been best at propaganda. Left-wing propaganda has almost always been more effective than right-wing propaganda throughout history. So, of course, the left in this 21st century, in this transition to democracy, has managed to establish a figure that they've hammered in for a long time, and that I think is slowly starting to be destroyed, which is the fascist bogeyman. They label anything unlike themselves as fascist, which we're seeing. I think this will eventually backfire on them. That's why fewer and fewer people defend this amorphous label that doesn't serve to define anything except whatever they themselves aren't. Something, by the way, that's very totalitarian on their part. But what happens? That until social media came along, in my opinion, to reverse this situation, the fascist bogeyman had the Popular Party completely terrified. Because the Popular Party has always tried to present itself as a moderate center-right party, with certain conservative ideals, but also with a sense of institutional responsibility. They lowered their heads to avoid being lumped in with the fascist bogeyman. History and the present show it hasn't worked out for them. It turned out badly for them since they're still seen as part of that fascist bogeyman and haven't figured out how to fight the culture war. So I always get the feeling that the People's Party has always gone around with its head down, not trying to stand up for conservative values, which are necessary in a society. It's necessary to have conservatism. We need people who defend the West's core pillars: Christian values, tradition, history, and culture. And that, which did exist to some extent in Aznar's People's Party, maybe, or in Fraga's People's Alliance, is something that completely breaks down when the left starts to completely harass the debate and culture war through the fascist bogeyman. That's what has turned the People's Party into the Socialist Party, just a decade behind. The People's Party now supports everything the Socialist Party advocated 10 years ago. In the end, I think they're essentially the same party, and it's a complete failure by the People's Party for not knowing how to fight the culture war with dignity and pride.
Ruben, I want to change things up a bit and pivot this conversation. Let's talk now about our ideologies. Every day I identify less and less with American liberalism. I mean, when it comes to economics, I agree with a lot of things. I'm not a crazy interventionist. I'm not that kind of person. But liberalism taken to the extreme is the individual above everything else. And look, that's not a bad thing, because I don't think the collective should ever have the legal possibility to crush the individual. But there are a lot of nuances to all of this. It's important for human beings to have a collective consciousness of the nation. I think it's important for people, and it's always been this way, to put their tribe first, at least a little bit. It's also important that the tribe doesn't crush the individual, if you'll pardon the redundancy. What differences do you see between liberalism, which is also labeled as fascist nowadays, by the way, and the conservatism that you and I defend?
Very good question. Yes, well, I think that, to pick up on the idea you had, I believe we're in a world where liberalism is less and less necessary, and intervention is more and more needed. Many people will call you a social communist for that statement.
This is leftist.
Yes, of course. Well, let's see. The main difference is the starting point of each one. Let's see if we want to call them ideologies. I don't like the word ideology. I've always believed in ideas over ideology. There's a fundamental nuance between the two. Let's just call it ideology so everyone gets it. Liberalism has the pernicious tendency to often turn into atomism. That is, it's not just a society, but a group of individuals who, separated from each other, can form a society. This falls apart everywhere, right? Because you can ask a question, right? And that is, can liberalism coexist with morality? First, you must define morality, which requires asking if morality exists. What is morality? It's important to distinguish morality from ethics, as these terms are often confused. Morality is the set of practices, traditions, and customs that prevail in a society. Ethics is the individual ability that we humans have to reflect on morality, right? In Spain, bullfighting is considered moral, something that, for example, in other countries would be understood as immoral or as amoral if there is no judgment about bullfighting, right? Our ethics can lead us to different views on morality and bullfighting, right? Knowing that morality establishes bullfighting in Spain, well, you could have a better opinion of bullfighting and I could have a worse opinion, right? But morality is what exists. Morality, in my opinion, is hardly compatible with liberalism, which is based on an individualistic atomism. Why? Well, because an individual who is granted any kind of guarantee, any kind of autonomy, can oppose the morality of a nation. An individual can reject the Christian values that have always prevailed throughout the history of the West. Well, we could acknowledge that an individual could be agnostic, we could acknowledge that he could be an atheist. That is more about freedom of religious belief than about morality. You can't destroy the values that built your society. You can never go against the values that have laid the foundations for what has allowed you to be who you are. Liberalism doesn't acknowledge this, does it? Another core issue is that liberalism, in my view, has led to the current problem of globalization and globalism. What is globalization? In economic terms, it's the result of a highly accelerated form of capitalism that puts the ideology of consumerism above any subjective assessment we as citizens might make of the construct of nationhood. Morally, globalization destroys national identity. Let me give you an example to show how far this goes. In 1933, the Montevideo Convention was signed. The Montevideo Convention, well, it was relevant from the point of view of international law because what it did was establish the definition of what a nation is, what a country is in general terms, right? And in that definition, in the Montevideo Convention of 1933, it was said that a nation was the sum of four elements: a population within the boundaries of a territory under the control of a government with the legal capacity to enter into agreements with other sovereign states, right? This is an aseptically positivist definition that is based on the idea that a nation is only population, territory, government, and capacity. The nation has a fifth element, identity, its culture. Defining a nation by population, territory, government, and capacity is like calling you Jota, just flesh and bones. No, Jota is much more. I am much more too. I am DNA, a person, a spirit, a soul, a way of being, something that distinguishes me from others. Globalism targets the fifth pillar, a nation's soul and identity, by imposing the 21st century's new religion, woke culture. Let's not deceive ourselves. Woke culture, which the left now embraces, results from globalization driven by today's unchecked liberalism. I mean, this left that claims to be Marxist, this left that says, well, anyway, yes, that it's revolutionary and goes against the status quo is actually the most reactionary thing that exists. Today's parliamentary left isn't Marxist or communist, it's post-neoliberal. They discuss overcoming capitalism, not destroying it. How depends on who you ask. Some are degrowth advocates, others social democrats, but they all share the same foundations, which is the problem. I believe conservatism must firmly oppose the notion that morality doesn't exist or should be replaced.
Why do you think the word identity has such extremely negative connotations nowadays?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it all comes from the 2030 agenda. Look, I think we need to pause and reflect here. What is the 2030 agenda? In political terms, it's a plan. Not in a conspiratorial way, but simply, it's a plan, a strategy that all 193 United Nations member states must align with, since they unanimously approved it in 2015. Morally, it's a political religion. As a new political religion, what it seeks is to destroy any trace of previous civilizations in order to promise a new civilization. However, it's a political religion with a fundamental difference compared to any other Abrahamic religion. And the thing is, unlike Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, with the 2030 agenda, you don't have the option to decide whether you want to follow that faith or not. You have to comply with it by legal mandate. If you don't like it, I'm sorry, but that's how things are now. It's the promise of transhumanism, again offering the idea of a super self, a human who can transcend personal limits, society, and nation. So what this does is undermine the identity of nations. And it does so in such a persuasive way that even the nations themselves believe it's bad to have their own identity. One way to illustrate this is, for example, what happens when Spain joins the European Union. When Spain joins the European Union, what it does is give up part of its sovereignty so that all of this can become part of a supranational organization. What this supranational organization does is legislate on certain conditions or powers that the Spanish state previously had as a sovereign entity, and now it has. An organization that operates through offices in Brussels, Luxembourg, Strasbourg, and Frankfurt, without having the slightest idea of what is happening in Spain. That is a huge problem. That our monetary policy is in the hands of some gentleman in Frankfurt is an outrage. It is an attack against the sovereignty of nations, because a country's economic policy is a coin with two sides, fiscal policy and monetary policy. If we take away monetary policy, we can only conduct economic policy through fiscal policy. This is a huge problem. So I believe that the harm done to the idea of identity comes directly from woke culture, which is the manifestation or materialization of the 2030 agenda, which of course is constantly working to undermine that fifth element of every nation, which is its own identity.
Not only to undermine it, but also to deny the importance it has when it comes to defining it.
Of course.
It's at the very least concerning. The truth is that I also very much agree with the view you present here that identity is even more important than territory. Because, I mean, if in Spain, in this piece of territory, you remove the Spaniards and have 50 million Chinese people living there, is this Spain or is this China?
Sure, exactly. You know what the problem is? Democracy allows it. Our democratic system, I don't know if you want to go deeper into this topic later, allows this to happen, right? I recommend everyone to read a novel by Michel Houellebecq called Submission, which at first is a dystopian novel, but I think little by little it's getting closer to the harsh reality that, like,
many dystopian novels, you know?
Like many dystopian novels, right? I think that in many centuries, it will be studied in history books as an absolutely prophetic novel about what happened, what was right in front of us, and what we were never able to see, right? Exactly, you explained it well. For example, as you mentioned about the Chinese, a party could be formed as a brotherhood of Chinese people living in Spain, right? Imagine that this party, because of the birth policies that are deeply rooted in Chinese culture among themselves, in other words, because of a moral code that leads them to have more children and reproduce. More than the Spanish, there comes a time when in Spain, there are 25 million Chinese or people of Chinese origin and 25 million Spaniards. That Chinese political party, uniting 25 million Chinese in Spain, would have all the necessary majorities to change Spain's laws. If Spain changes legislatively, no matter how much we're within the same piece of population, we will never be able to speak of Spain again. That, what we're referring to, even if we have a government, territory, capacity, and, well, a population within the geopolitical coordinates of what is Spain, we will never be able to speak of Spain because that fifth element that the Montevideo Convention omits, the identity of nations, has been destroyed. That's why I always say democracy is an immoral system. It's immoral, lacking any sense of right or wrong. Right and wrong only depend on what the majority decides at any time. This is a huge problem. The moment democracy allows the identity of a nation to be destroyed, we can't accept it as a valid system.
Let's get into that topic. Look how you're smiling. You're excited to discuss it. Let's talk about how democracy allows this. Let's talk about the flaws that democracy has. And I hope Woke Up News makes us a little clip.
Yeah, well, let's see. To start criticizing democracy, we have to start by defining what democracy is. I start from the premise that democracy is immoral. Now then, saying that democracy is immoral means that we first have to define what democracy is and what morality is. Morality is the set of traditions and customs that prevail in a society. What is democracy? We have to understand democracy as a way of organizing power within a society. And this is where many of the detractors of my argument come in saying, no, democracy isn't that bad because it's better to have a democracy than a dictatorship. This is a false dilemma that wrongly forces you to choose between democracy and dictatorship. It's not true. There are many possibilities between democracy and dictatorship that also redistribute power in society. For example, a system where the distribution of power is guaranteed within an elitist group or a qualified group would be a technocracy, an epistocracy. A way to distribute power in a society where power rests with a monarch would be an absolute monarchy. A society where there is no state or superstate structure to channel the organization of power would be an anarchy. The belief that only democracy or dictatorship exists is completely false. Democracy is defined as distributing power among the people. Demos means people and cracy means power, so power lies with the people. Democracy has been corrupted and has completely lost the meaning of the word itself. Because Athenian democracy has nothing to do with the representative democracy that we have in most of the West. And here I want to clarify something, because there is a discourse on social media that is also critical of democracy, but it does so from a different perspective, and sometimes it tends to get mixed up with my own argument. It's this discourse from RUBÉN Gisbert and...
I was going to mention it since RUBÉN Gisbert doesn't see it as a representative democracy.
Of course, exactly. RUBÉN Gisbert, without implying any connotations, as I don't know him and I don't have...
I get along well with...
him.
He has already been here, and he will come back soon.
Very well, I don't know him and I have nothing against him. I know his line of thinking. It comes from the thesis and the ideas of Antonio Garcia Trevijano. And that's what he says. To put it very simply and so people can understand it easily, for me, RUBÉN Gisbert is a democracy purist. That is, he believes that democracy in Spain is not as good as he would like, and that's why he wants to establish a different model of democracy than the one we have today, which is a democracy by direct mandate, with open lists and more similar to a presidential system than to a representative system. My position is, I share with RUBÉN Gisbert the criticism of the democracy that exists today in Spain, but for me, the way to overcome it would not be through a democracy by direct mandate, nor a democracy with open lists, nor a representative democracy, but with a technocracy. For me, that's the key. What is the problem with democracy? Let's continue. Democracy can never be confused. This is a false equivalence with universal suffrage. Universal suffrage is a necessary condition, but not sufficient for democracy to exist. Democracy is a sum of several elements. One of them is universal suffrage. But besides universal suffrage, there are other elements. For example, the separation of powers. A democracy with universal suffrage but without separation of powers is not truly a democracy. This is what happens in Spain. Indeed, in Spain, there is no separation of powers at all. We'll go into more detail later, and I'll explain why. Another element is equality before the law. A democracy with universal suffrage and separation of powers, but lacking equality before the law, would not truly be a democracy. A democracy must also include a set of fundamental rights and public freedoms, such as freedom of artistic creation, assembly, and expression. These elements are what make up what must be the cornerstone of any democracy. They are the elements on which a democracy must revolve. In Spain, this does not exist. And what's more, its absence is especially worrying because what democracy does is formally recognize the existence of these elements, but not guarantee them in practice. Democracy tells you, Jota, that you have freedom of speech and that you can freely express yourself on any topic you want. But democracy keeps the hate speech card up its sleeve to tell you, look, you can say whatever you want, except if you mess with certain groups that are considered minorities and unprotected, because in that case, I play the hate speech card and you are prosecuted. That's no longer freedom of speech. It's restricted freedom of speech. Democracy claims to have separation of powers with executive, legislative, and judicial branches, but in reality, these branches often interfere with each other. I mean, the moment a constitutional court is appointed by judges who receive preferential treatment from political parties, there is direct interference from the executive branch in the judicial branch. The fact that Cándido Conde Pumpido, former Attorney General appointed by Zapatero, is president of the Constitutional Court is clear interference. The General Council of the Judiciary, meant to oversee judges, is not actually part of the judiciary. To make it more autonomous, more independent, it is made up of members who, once again, owe favors to political parties. It's a system called democracy, but without separation of powers. That's not true democracy. That's a partisan democracy. And from there, you can call it whatever you want. If you want to call it a partytocracy, call it a partyocracy. Party dictatorship, call it party dictatorship. Party tyranny, call it that. But indeed, I agree with Rubén Gilberto that democracy in Spain does not exist as it should. However, my solution for this is not a presidential democracy, but a technocracy.
Let's define technocracy. How would those capable, prepared people with the ability and knowledge to lead society be chosen?
First, a couple quick clarifications so everyone is clear. First, technocracy and epistocracy are often used interchangeably, though there is a slight terminological difference. Technocracy refers to a government of experts, a government of technical experts. Epistocracy would be, more epistemologically speaking, a government of the wise, a government of people who have the knowledge to govern. That's the difference. One government is run by technicians, the other by the wise. Now, beyond that, I use them almost interchangeably because I think in the end, they serve to designate the same thing, which is an elite. Second clarification. The first is that I'll use technocracy and epistocracy interchangeably. Second, technocracy in Spain has a somewhat tarnished image due to its association with Opus Dei's control in the 1960s. It's an example we've had in Spain, through the approval in 1959 of the Social Stabilization Plan. Well, if I were to establish a technocracy today, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a Mexican technocracy. It was in the hands of Opus Dei. And starting from that basis, how do we set criteria to decide who can vote and who can be elected? You need to understand, Jota, that universal suffrage has two limits: active suffrage, which is your right to vote, and passive suffrage, which is the right to be elected. The limit I would set would be a limit on both active and passive suffrage. Why? Because I believe that not everyone should be able to vote, and not everyone can be a public representative.
That's true. I 100% agree with that.
That's the foundation that must be set. The next question is whether setting the exam means only like-minded people can vote. No, that's not the case. And I say this openly. Anyone who meets only the nationality requirements would have to take my exam. Only nationality requirements?
Now let's get into the nationality issue.
Regardless of whether it's a man or a woman, regardless of whether they're left-wing or right-wing.
Emphasize that for Wuko.
Regardless of whether it's a man or a woman, anyone could take that exam, because that's the key to guaranteeing equality. Look, sorry for going a bit off topic. I'll get back to it. I'll do it very quickly. What the left wants is not to seek full equality, they seek equality of outcomes. Equality has to be at the starting point, not in the outcome. Equality of outcomes is absurd. It's a metaphysical impossibility. What I want is for everyone to have the same conditions, to start from the same place, not to reach the same results. Equality of outcomes is, imagine, Jota, that we take an exam, you get a 6 and I get a 4, and the teacher, in order to...
It would probably be the other way around, Ruben.
It's okay, so I get a 6 and you get a 4.
You get a 7 and I get a 5, so we both pass.
No, but the example was like I said, a 6 and a 4. The teacher, aiming for equal results, says, Ruben, since you scored 2 more points than Jota, give him 1 point so you both get a 5 and pass. This is equality of results, it's unnatural, it's against meritocracy and against any society that wants to prosper. Equality of opportunity means that you and I can both take that exam, regardless of the grade we get afterwards. That's what needs to be guaranteed, and that's what the left is trying to destroy. So anyone who meets, I repeat, the requirements of nationality and of course being of legal age, which are the two limits already established today to be able to vote in Spain, could take that exam. And from there, what kind of exam would be implemented? Well, what needs to be said is that a technocracy can be implemented through an exam system to qualify to vote, or it can be implemented without an exam. What would be an example of technocracy without an exam? Well, for example, a technocracy where everyone could vote, but there would be an autonomous, independent body made up of a council of experts or wise people that could veto those decisions made by political parties when those decisions go against morality, efficiency, effectiveness, and so on. What's the problem? The big risk is that this independent institution, similar to today's General Council of the Judiciary, could again be overtaken and controlled by political party influence. That's why another option is an exam to qualify to vote. What should be on it? I think it should include technical criteria. A person who can't tell the difference between the Congress of Deputies and the Senate is someone who doesn't know what each of the two ballots they put in the ballot boxes on election day is for. This is very serious, and that person will have a say over others just like you and I do. We should first inform that person about what they're voting for, so they understand their vote is a responsibility to others. The idea of responsibility is also the reason why a driving test is required. Why do you need to pass a test to drive? Why do you need a license, which means passing a theoretical test and then a practical test? Because driving is a responsibility not only for yourself, but also for others. And to clarify, some say a technocracy wouldn't always achieve better results than a democracy. Well, just like requiring drivers to have a license doesn't prevent accidents, but it does reduce the risk of them happening. So, I think that's the foundation. Technocracy has to include an exam based on technical knowledge. We could also introduce ethical knowledge, because a person who was a psychopath, someone who didn't have the same moral concepts that we uphold in the West, obviously couldn't participate in a society because they would be more likely to seek its destruction, starting from a psychological foundation that isn't balanced. But well, yes, I think it's an open debate, and I'm willing to listen to proposals for that exam. I mean, I'm not very dogmatic either.
You mentioned something about nationality. I want us to define it because nowadays people confuse being born in a territory with being from that territory, being with a capital B, okay? That's something more philosophical, more about identity, as you mentioned. If I move to China, as I said to Nunja in the debate, and have children there with my wife, the Chinese wouldn't claim my children are Chinese just because they were born there. And you can extrapolate that to anywhere in the world, except in Europe. We Europeans are the only ones who are forbidden to recognize or say who is or isn't European for fear of being labeled racist, fascist, or whatever. That really strikes me, because obviously, in fact, white South Africans are denied their Africanness for being white. Now, don't even think about telling the French national team that they're not European, because then you're an evil fascist. I'd like to delve a bit deeper into this topic with you, because I find that double standard very curious. And I also find it interesting how even we Europeans aren't really sure what nationality means.
Of course, well, I think we need to distinguish first, because people often confuse nationality with residency. A person, legally nowadays in Spain, a person can come to live in Spain with a residency permit without having nationality. So they're two different terms. Then, residency can also give you access and possibilities so that after living for a certain amount of time, 10 years or whatever, with family ties that you can prove, you might be able to get nationality sooner than you would if you came as someone with no connection to the country. But they are different terms. The concept of nationality that I use, I think it's the most natural, it's the most logical, is the one based on ius sanguinis. It's the right of blood. Nationality is not given to you by the place where you are born, it's given to you by the family you come from. This is obvious. I'm going to give an example that Carlos Paz once told me, which I found very funny. If we put a dog in a fish tank, it doesn't become a fish. And if the dog reproduces inside the fish tank, even if gills start to appear through natural evolution, that won't be a fish. It will be a mutation between a dog and but it will never be a fish. If two Chinese people move to Spain and their child is Chinese, that child, regardless of how well he speaks Spanish or embraces its culture, will not be considered Spanish. We can grant him a residence permit if we determine he is culturally adapted.
Citizenship too, the passport.
The passport, yes, but under jus sanguinis, that person isn't Spanish. Jus sanguinis means the right to nationality is inherited through your family's bloodline. I think it must be managed. Otherwise, we risk distorting things and leaving nationality decisions to a dangerously broad discretion. Nationality is decided by the government in power. Nationality is decided by whoever proposes to make a change to the nationality regime in the civil code. This is dangerous because the Socialist Party could come to power with a broader view of nationality than Vox, but then Vox might govern and restrict that concept. I believe it shouldn't depend on the party in power at the moment, but rather on what nationality is and what has always been understood as nationality, which is jus sanguinis, the right of blood.
I also want to discuss natural law, which we mentioned off camera earlier.
Yes.
Explain to me a little bit what natural law is.
Natural law is a branch of the philosophy of law and a tool for understanding what rules are, how they should work, and the criteria they should follow. There are many branches, many streams, and even within natural law theory itself, there are many different schools of thought. The main schools of thought to explain or understand a legal system, which is the name given to that set of norms, principles, and rules that exist within a legal framework in a country, there are many possibilities. One, as we mentioned, is natural law theory, which comes from natural law. Another is positivism, and then there is a kind of legal realism, rationalism, and so on. The two branches that clash most directly with each other are natural law theory and positivism. Positivism is internally divided between positivists and post-positivists. Well, this is a definition, a very niche debate. In simple terms, positivism holds that morality can be separated from law, allowing a nation to exist without a fixed morality, as morality is defined solely by current laws. That's what we discussed earlier, right? To me, democracy is a strictly positivist system because it allows a political party that could destroy the nation and morality to still exist within our territory. This is a positivist idea, which is based on separating morality in order to legislate within the borders of a territory. Natural law is based on the idea that there are rights that are intrinsic first to the person and second to the nation. The legal system we develop from a natural law view doesn't need to override inherent morality or the rights everyone is born with, but should instead guarantee them. In that sense, the state does not become a kind of neutral state that depends on the government in power and the ideology that prevails at each moment in history, but rather it becomes a state that guarantees those rights, right? Natural law theory is based on the idea that all human beings, by the mere fact of being born, nacemos con el derecho a la vida. In that sense, the state does not create the right to life, nor does it have the power to modify the right to life, it simply guarantees it. It guarantees it because of our condition as human beings, right? Positivism tells you no, that if a state wants to make some kind of modification to the right to life in the future, as we are seeing with euthanasia and abortion, it can do so. Natural law stands in opposition because it says, look, there are rights that are above the legislation of the state at any given time, which are the rights that belong to us as people and to the territory in which we live. Ese es el modelo de naturalismo, the natural law that I defend and that I believe we should recover.
Can morality be separated from the nation?
No, of course not, because then, we completely lose our bearings in everything we're experiencing. If we separate morality from the nation, we could allow a political party to propose, as a legislative reform, introducing an exception to the criminal offense of assault that would allow us to live in a cannibalistic society. And hey, look, if you, between midnight and 1 in a certain town one day a year, like The Purge, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Purge, what they do is suspend existing legislation in the United States for 1 night a year, and from there, any kind of crime can be committed. This is what happens when the moral standard is set aside. Western morality is very different from Eastern morality. Muslim cultures, though not all, and this is a simplification, are mentioned just to help us understand each other. It's not an attempt to attack Muslims or Islam. We need to separate and clarify things. However, their morality involves women's submission to men's will. The fact that women have to be veiled is something they tacitly accept when they are born into a culture that is, yes, clearly misogynistic, where women obey the interests of men. In the West, we have understood that this is not the case. If we move away from Western morality, we are moving away from the only tool that allows us to distinguish what we consider acceptable and what we do not. So, morality always has to be the measuring stick, and morality has to exist, because if morality didn't exist, think about this. If morality didn't exist, my question is, why should there be a set of rules? If there were no criteria that allow us as a society to determine what is good and what is bad, it wouldn't even make sense to establish a constitution, a penal code, a civil code. It wouldn't make sense. Because if anything goes, if we live in a nation where absolutely everything is permissible, where we don't understand that something is good or bad, we wouldn't associate killing with evil and loving your neighbor with good. If we don't understand that there is an element of evil or perversity in murder, we don't need to classify murder as a crime. Societies lacking morals are bound to self-destruct through natural evolution, as Hobbes noted in Leviathan. Hobbes said that man is a wolf to man. He said that human beings, in the state of nature, will use all means that can guarantee their survival. That's why there has to be a state to set a limit on human actions, because if it didn't exist, we would end up living by the law of the jungle. That's what morality is supposed to be for.
Can morality be separated from religion?
Very good question. No. I mean, yes, let's see. Actually, no, and yes. We need to clarify. Natural law theory has an aspect where indeed natural law is aligned with divine law. But then there is also a branch of natural law theorists. Here we can mention Leo Strauss, who try to find more rationalist arguments. That is, those who separate natural law from divine law. I don't think so. It must always be guided by morality, which stems from our Christian values. I mentioned this during the debate. The three pillars on which Western society is built are Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian values. I mean, the Ten Commandments today really aren't that different from what we consider the prevailing morality in the West. They still match.
Actually, the one about your father and mother, more and more,
That one,
is indeed being completely...
it is being destroyed and displaced. For example, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall love your neighbor. These are ideas that we still have today. Religion should be a starting point, in my view. We need to know our origins to decide our direction. Without understanding our past, we can't shape our present or future. Now, I do admit that a person can be agnostic or can be atheist. And in fact, I admit that someone can be agnostic and a natural law theorist. It doesn't necessarily have to be aligned with faith, although many branches have had this division. Now, I defer to the evidence, and the evidence, what history shows us, is that the societies that have prospered the most have been Christian societies, above any other society, above any other religion. So yes, I think it's increasingly necessary today to undeniably recover Christian values and bring them back to what once made us prosper.
I love that reflection. Let's move to another section and discuss the economy. Earlier you mentioned that there can be no sovereignty without our own currency, without printing money, and that monopoly is held by people in Frankfurt. Let's get into that topic a little bit.
Yes, indeed. The economy has two tools to carry out economic policy within a country, which are fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy refers to those policies that come from the legislation of each country. For example, fiscal policy would be establishing an exemption in the income tax for families with more than 3 children as a proposal. That would be a fiscal policy tool. Establishing an exemption for those people who come from a family where there is a victim of terrorism. That is also fiscal policy. It is using criterios, morals, a certain degree of morality, to establish tax breaks or reductions for each tax. That is fiscal policy. Monetary policy, as you have rightly said, is the issuance of currency. It is the amount of money that is in circulation within a country. When you give up that sovereignty to the central bank, you lose one of the two essential tools that every nation must have to be able to decide the amount of money that is in circulation. For me, this is a mistake because I start from the thesis that a person, many will say this is a fallacy, I'll elaborate on it later. I start from the thesis that, indeed, a person in Frankfurt is not going to know better than a person in Albacete what the needs of that person in Albacete are. Starting from that basis. And that a person in Frankfurt may follow interests different from those that should prevail within our nation, within Spain. Giving up sovereignty is like, I don't know, like going to war with a machete and an AK-47 and handing the AK-47 over to the enemy side. It's missing a major chance to help the nation prosper. Yes, I am very much a sovereigntist. Part of Spain's sovereignty has to be about recovering this identity again. That also has to be regained through monetary policy. Some people ask, if we stay in Europe, where will the money come from? But we should also ask, how much do we owe Europe? Because Europe is not an altruistic system, the European Union, to be more precise, is not an altruistic society where any kind of thing is guaranteed without any kind of compensation in return. To give you an idea, Europe has not been able to guarantee the maximum level of debt allowed for its countries. You know that the maximum debt limit allowed by the European Union for its member states is 60% of GDP. Supposedly, if what the European Union theoretically sets out was actually followed, debt couldn't be more than 60% of GDP in each nation. Spain has more than 100% of...
I think we're at about 120 more or less.
It has gone down a bit. We were at 115, but now we're at 103, 105%. Has the debt gone down? Yes. Good news at least. Yes.
We are still living beyond what we produce in a year.
Obviously, I'm a sovereigntist and think monetary policy should be controlled by the nation, not by officials at the European Central Bank in Frankfurt.
That's where I'm going to counter you with the argument that I've always been given when talking about this topic, and it's an extremely solid argument. So, Pedro Sanchez would control monetary policy.
Well,
Whoa! My nightmare. I prefer it to be in the hands of the people from Frankfurt. That's what people tell me, and deep down, I can't help but agree with them, in a way.
this is the same argument I brought up when I asked Eduardo Garcia Serrano about monarchy versus republic. Eduardo Garcia Serrano is a Falangist and a Republican. But he told me, he said, look, I've always considered myself a Republican. But of course, if a republic means putting the office of head of state in a politician's hands, I'd almost prefer a monarch like the one we have, who doesn't do much, rather than having that office in the hands of, I don't know, Pedro Sanchez, or whoever Pedro Sanchez chose, or Feijóo, or I don't know, man, Ángel Gabilondo, like Yolanda Diaz once said, right? Well, yes, indeed, that's a problem. That's what Junts said too, right? When Junts threatened to block parliament by voting against Pedro Sanchez and the Socialist Party's decisions, they said they'd block it. The question was whether it's better for Junts to support Pedro Sanchez's government so he can keep governing, or for Junts to block it. I think in a utopian model, I believe that political parties shouldn't exist in the first place. There should be technicians, experts, and they should be the ones in charge of governing. I also said that in the debate. Note that it was somewhat premonitory. Jota, do you remember during our debate with Anuj, I criticized democracy, saying it doesn't give citizens the best possible outcome? It didn't provide it because Spain's top economist doesn't lead the Ministry of Economy. It doesn't provide it because the Ministry of Transport's head isn't Spain's top transport expert.
Sí, justo
Esto fue
viene.
The accident was yesterday.
absolutely prophetic, unfortunately. So, of course, if we offered a society, a model to distribute power among the people, where instead of having political parties, which, by the way, do you know what the point is? I'm getting a bit off topic, but anyway, I'll get back on track. Do you know what the historical purpose of political parties is? Look, democracy, when it first emerged through direct mandate, arose in a demographic context where societies were so small that each public representative had a very small group of citizens. Imagine if we filled this room with 10 people who live in this region. Imagine we define this room as a region and 10 of us live here. Each of those 10 people would have contact with a representative of that region. This is possible when the demographics of societies or city-states or countries are small. When the growth of a nation is not just going from tens of thousands to more tens of thousands of inhabitants, but from tens of thousands to millions of inhabitants. You have to look for an intermediary, a structure that serves as a springboard so that citizens, who are now millions and not just a few thousand, can get closer to public decision-making. That structure that should serve as a springboard is political parties. What's the problem? Democracy becomes corrupted and stops being democracy at the moment when those political parties don't act as a springboard to boost citizens, but as a ceiling to prevent citizens from getting closer to power and from bringing power closer to themselves. This is what political parties have become, completely removed from the historical meaning and the meaning of the word party itself. Why was I telling you all this? Because I firmly advocate for a society where there are no parties, a society where there are experts. People who, without needing to do propaganda or resort to populism, we, all the citizens, all Spaniards, can appoint the best economist to lead the Ministry of Economy. Top transportation expert in the Ministry of Transportation, leading healthcare expert in the Ministry of Health, top education expert, Spain's best ever teacher in the Ministry of Education. So we have a government of educated people who know what they're talking about, because if not, we could end up with the absolutely pathological and abnormal case we had in Spain of having a philosopher in charge of the Ministry of Health, Salvador Illa. How can you give the Ministry of Health to someone who is a philosopher by training? A philosopher can be in the Ministry of Culture.
In education. What is Oscar Puente?
Good question. Well, apart from being a huge idiot, I don't know. Oscar Puente is a criminal. I mean, he's a guy, and his background is probably law, I imagine. He must have studied law. Sorry for the insult, but I really can't stand him. I think he's the ultimate representation of the vilest sectarianism, someone who has no sense of honor or patriotism, but only a purely partisan and self-serving interest, which is the most dangerous thing. If a party is a parasite, then someone who's a parasite within that party is a double parasite, a stowaway, exploiting those already exploiting the country. That's how I see Oscar Puente. So it's a technocracy. Of course, to build this, I know that formally it sounds very good and it's very nice, but in practice it would be very complicated because you would practically have to abolish it by making a complete amendment to the Constitution of 78.
So, are you in favor of changing the Constitution or the 78 regime as they call it?
Yes, the 78 regime, absolutely. For a very simple reason. Let's see, I do recognize, not to be too black and white, I do recognize that the Constitution was a step forward, a significant step forward compared to the technocracy of the 60s established by Franco. For me, that step forward is the Catalogue of Fundamental Rights and Public Liberties, recognized in Articles 14 to 29 of the Constitution's first section, second chapter, first title. Addressing a common constitutional law debate over whether Articles 29 to 35 are also considered fundamental rights. This is also a very niche debate. This catalogue of fundamental rights and public freedoms, as I mentioned before, is one of the elements, a necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy to exist. It exists and is formally guaranteed, but the problem is that it is not upheld in practice. Because of what I was telling you, for example, freedom of expression or the right to honor. The right to honor can't be guaranteed when it clashes with freedom of expression, so a balance has to be struck between the two principles. If a balancing system has to be applied, as the post-positivists say, one principle will have to take precedence over the other. If one principle takes precedence over the other, then there is a principle that is not being guaranteed. So of course, I do acknowledge that progress. Now, as for everything else, we have to understand that the meaning of the Constitution of 68 had as its sole objective, first, to try to get it signed. And this is not easy, because the fathers who signed the Constitution are seven, the seven fathers of the Constitution. There are three from UCD, one from the Socialist Party, one from Popular Alliance, one from the Communist Party, and one from the Catalan minorities, who is Miquel Roca y Lulen. For the seven fathers of the Constitution to sign the Constitution, it has to be made amorphous enough so that all of them identify with it. And that's why our Constitution only responds to purely secessionist, purely independentist interests. Why do Miquel Roca y Lulen and Jordi Soletura sign the Constitution? They sign it because the Constitution sets up a system for becoming an autonomous community, with some communities enjoying privileges over others. Catalonia, by the way, just to clarify, autonomous communities didn't exist before the Constitution. That's why the Constitution, if you open it, the Constitution of 78 doesn't mention autonomous communities. They were created afterwards. What the Constitution does is establish procedures so that autonomous communities can be formed as such. It allowed territories with a shared culture, identity, history, or tradition to become autonomous communities, granting a certain freedom. But it recognizes an accelerated procedure for becoming autonomous communities for Catalonia, the Basque country, and, I don't want to make a mistake, I think for Andalusia and Galicia. Why? Because it's a constitution that serves the interests of the parties and ideologies that were nationalist. That's the historical reason. So they would be able to sign it. So, that needs to be completely abolished, the regime of 78 needs to end, and of course, a new constituent process must be established based on refoundation. As I always say, and as I've already said, as the person I look up to said, José Antonio Primo de Rivera, always based on the homeland, bread, and justice. That must be the sole and constant goal toward which the future of a nation must converge.
He's a follower of José Antonio. Yes, that makes two followers of José Antonio who've come here.
One is Fernando Paz. Fernando Paz.
Yes, a great one. Tell me a little bit about the figure of José Antonio. What was his political vision? Because it's true that it's a political vision that dies before it takes shape. He dies young. I mean, he doesn't even get to fully develop.
Of course.
Exactly. Ideologically, he didn't develop enough to say, these are my foundations.
Of course. We must distinguish. He dies because he is murdered. José Antonio Primo de Rivera is one of the most...
He dies of cancer.
He is one of the martyrs who, for various reasons, will never be recognized by the historical memory law or the democratic memory law. Well, the first thing we need to talk about is the figure of José Antonio. José Antonio, as I always say, was an intellectual. He was a guy who traded weapons for words, for dialectics, for conversation. He was a guy who managed to make everyone who knew him, regardless of their political ideology, recognize his humanity above anything else. We can see this in all kinds of testimonies. He was very good friends with Lorca, with Federico Garcia Lorca. He got along well with him, and in fact, the person he didn't have a good personal relationship with was Franco. Look, there's an anecdote. The link that connected Franco with José Antonio Primo de Rivera was Serrano Suñer. Serrano Suñer was a classmate of José Antonio Primo de Rivera in law school when José Antonio studied law, and he was also Franco's brother-in-law. So Serrano Suñer once, obviously before the outbreak of the Civil War, brought together José Antonio Primo de Rivera and Franco at his house. It is the only documented occasion we have that José Antonio and Franco met in person. What José Antonio says is that he was shocked because he didn't see Franco as someone who had a very clear state project, who wanted to move toward a nation with common ideas, but rather he saw him as a military man. Yes, and to be fair, as a military man he was unbeatable. Franco was feared by armies worldwide because he earned all his military promotions through merit. Not because of seniority, this is unheard of. He was a very feared military man, but as a statesman, José Antonio doubted his abilities more. It's often said, José Antonio once remarked, "My father was a dictator too, but at least he was a nice guy." So, he was someone who, at least, shied away from the idea of a country that Franco wanted to build, because he didn't see a clear vision for the country and Franco himself. He was, on the other hand, an intellectual. He was a guy who studied law, who set up his own law firm, who was also a member of parliament for a very brief period in the Cortes, and who had a gift for oratory that, to me, has never been matched. I have never seen in Spain a politician, neither before nor after probably, with a gift for oratory similar to his. Most of all, what interests me about him is his humanity. We can discuss his work later if you want. To recognize the humanity that existed in another person, even if they might differ ideologically, right? That's what I think is being completely lost nowadays. Today we're dehumanizing. You explained it very well in the debate. You said, hey, we live in a time where we're dehumanizing people who come here to breathe, to debate, and as soon as we see that someone is from the left, without even stopping to listen to what they defend, how they have to defend it, we're directly questioning them instead of questioning their ideas. That's the absolute result of dehumanization, and it's something that everyone agrees is contrary to the way José Antonio conceived of people. So regarding him and his work, he actually didn't get to develop it because he was indeed assassinated in the Alitea prison. Alicante. But for me, there's an essential trilemma that perfectly defines the idea behind José Antonio Primo de Rivera, which is homeland, bread, and justice. We can play around to see how relevant and necessary this trilemma is today by imagining what would happen in a society if we removed one of these three pillars. We can imagine a society where there is a certain sense of nation, of homeland, where there is bread, meaning there are raw materials, but there is no justice. That could bring us back to Venezuela's former narco-dictatorship. I don't deny that people in Venezuela were very patriotic. I don't deny that there were raw materials, even resources within Venezuela, but the problem was that there was no justice. There was no justice to redistribute because the vast majority of raw materials were accumulated by a tiny minority of the population, a tyrannical class of Nicolas Maduro's regime. That's what happens if we remove the leg of justice. If there is no justice, if we have a society without justice, what happens is that no matter how much bread there is or how much national or patriotic feeling there is, the nation completely falls apart. It limps. A nation where there is a sense of nationhood and a sense of justice, but there is no bread, would be a metaphysical impossibility. A nation where there are no raw materials to prosper is doomed to become the satellite state of another nation that provides them in exchange for the surrender of sovereignty. And what happens in a nation where there is bread, there is justice, but there is no idea of nationhood? Something similar to what's happening in Western societies would occur. Western societies attack that idea of identity through those supranational organizations like the European Union or the United Nations. That's why they want us to believe identity is just territory, population, government, and capacity, so we don't see that there is an identity, something that makes Spaniards Spaniards, the French French, Germans Germans, and Italians Italians. There is an identity. What the European Union is doing is turning nations almost into giant supermarkets, huge supermarkets that move goods, services, capital, and people freely across the European Economic Area through this open borders policy. Well, I don't deny that we can trade among ourselves, but by doing that, we are attacking what makes Spain Spain and France France. And this, look where it comes from. It comes from a trilemma that José Antonio formulated 90 years ago. I would emphasize the trilemma of homeland, bread, and justice.
How could it be rescued? Because in Spain, I think there isn't...
The only thing there is bread. Well, of course, exactly, right? Yes, the justice system in Spain is what it is, and there's debate about whether slow justice is true justice. I don't think so. Justice must act when needed. How would it be recovered? If you ask me, I'd approach it through technocracy, where the first step is to establish a moral basis. Let me clarify, since some find this dangerous and might call it totalitarian, tyrannical, or dictatorial. Morality stays the same or mostly unchanged, regardless of what the majority decides, for the reasons we discussed earlier, right? If a majority cannibal society emerged in Spain, being the majority wouldn't let them change the morality we've established. Cannibalism goes against what we want for our society. There must be a guiding idea behind the technocracy that leads Spain's recovery of sovereignty. Spain has to become sovereign again. Spain has to break away from the supranational organizations that undermine its identity and its sovereignty, which involve a constant transfer of powers to those supranational bodies like the European Union, the United Nations, or NATO, or the OECD, which is more of an economic union than a political one. So we have to recover our sovereignty. After regaining sovereignty, we must begin a refoundation process. When everything has failed us, when democracy fails us, because it promises us freedom, but what it brings is slavery and submission to the regime established in 1978. When politicians fail us, who supposedly propose to row in the same direction, but end up creating more polarization than there was before. When the free market fails us, which promises us prosperity but brings us debt, the only thing left for us is to start from scratch. To start from scratch again. To begin with our people, the only thing we share. The only thing that unites Spaniards is that we are Spaniards, that we share a common past. If we forget that common past, or silence it, or tarnish it, or cover it up, or hide it, what we're doing is creating a society where absolutely nothing unites us. I believe in a sovereign society, and I think that this process of refoundation, which for many may sound very communist, has to start from the bottom up. It has to start from the bottom up because of what I said, because those at the top have failed us, and when those at the top fail us, all we have left are those of us who have always been here. It's this idea that only the people can save the people. We've seen it in Havana, we've seen it in La Palma, we saw it in Adamus yesterday, we saw it on March 11th, 2004, only the people can save the people. If we want this to be the case, the people have to be united. To unite, we must acknowledge the problem. To solve that problem, I repeat, my solution is a process of refoundation, starting completely from scratch and always keeping in mind the recovery of the nation's sovereignty.
Count me in on that project. To wrap up, I think it's extremely important to have someone so knowledgeable and cultured regarding the history of José Antonio, the Falange, and fascism in general. I want you to clearly distinguish for me between the ideas of José Antonio, the ideas of Adolf, and the ideas of Mussolini. Because, as you've rightly said, for many people the bogeyman is fascist. Nowadays, people think that all of them were the same, that they all got along great, that maybe they all agreed on important issues like race, and I don't think so. There's a clear distinction between all of them, including General Franco. I think people need to start analyzing these phenomena in a much more critical way, in a much more academic way, in a much more intellectual way, and not as weapons. As throwing weapons that are used in politics today. So what is the main distinction?
Well,
you've already mentioned the human side.
Yes. Politically speaking, José Antonio was never a dictator. This needs to be made clear. José Antonio never took part in the murder of a single person. On the contrary, I've explained this many times. When many newspapers like ABC or La Nación started funding Falange, when Falange was created, there was a certain very conservative sector that wanted the Spanish Falange to become a pressure group, a violent group, a group of enforcers without any clear ideological or intellectual content, but simply to exert physical pressure. What José Antonio did was suppress that sector of the Falange that gave Falange no intellectual direction, meaning he always suppressed any slightest hint of violence that might exist.
Did they call José Antonio the Undertaker?
Yes, Juan Simón the Gravedigger. They called him that after a popular song of the time. Sobre Juan Simón. He constantly attended the funerals of Falangists killed by Chiribis, socialists, anarchists, anarcho-socialists, and others. So this is the first thing. José Antonio was never a dictator. José Antonio was never a murderer. He was an intellectual, purely an intellectual. Secondly, José Antonio did draw inspiration in his beginnings, just like the Yons, like the groups of Ramiro Ledesma Ramos and Onésimo Redondo from early fascism. This is a major debate because we first need to ask, is fascism, in my view, simply Mussolini's regime in Italy where he was in power? This is what Renzo de Felice said, who for me is one of the best historians of fascism, along with maybe Eric Begelin. They say that fascism is not a generic fascism, meaning we can't talk about generic fascism for anything other than Mussolini's specific regime. It is true that fascism can influence other regimes, and it's true that Ramiro Ledesma Ramos, mainly him, and also José Antonio, at the beginning have certain links or take on certain characteristics of fascism. José Antonio, for example, mentions in an introduction to Mussolini's doctrine of fascism how he traveled to Italy, met Mussolini, and at first was quite impressed by the patriarchal figure that Mussolini conveyed to him in his office, inside the Grand Palace. He said he finally understood fascism when he saw Mussolini acting like a patriarch from his palace balcony, overseeing the people to ensure their well-being. That image defined fascism for him. However, as José Antonio's brief intellectual career advanced, he distanced himself from fascism. In fact, he even said that corporatism, which is one of the essential pillars of fascism, is little more than hot air. As for capitalism, well, José Antonio was relatively critical of liberalism. I often say José Antonio was more critical of liberalism than Marxism. This doesn't mean he was a Marxist or communist. But José Antonio understood the need for the working class to come together under an ideology that, for him, well, was deceptive but necessary, like Marxism, as a logical response to what liberalism was. So the main difference is purely doctrinal, it's ideological. José Antonio starts off having approaches to fascism, just like Ramiro Ledesma Ramos and Onésimo Redondo, but he ends up completely distancing himself from it. And they do it formally as a result of a statement issued by the newspaper La Nación in 1974, in which it says that Falange Española is not a fascist party. He did this when fascism was at its height, so the smartest political move would have been to side with fascism. It's not the same as doing it today. It's a minority opinion. Indeed, at that time it was a majority opinion. It was at its absolute peak. And on the other hand, Hitler is a National Socialist. To understand National Socialism, you must grasp race theory, which José Antonio, for instance, openly rejects. José Antonio acknowledged the possibility of building a nation where different races could integrate, provided the nation's core values remained intact. He does this because he starts from some international law manuscripts that he studies, which are obviously not the same as those from which the National Socialist race theory starts. But well, that anti-Semitic branch, which is indeed characteristic of the National Socialists, was not so deeply rooted in the figure of José Antonio. There is an open debate about whether Franco's dictatorship can be considered anti-Semitic or not. While it was National Catholic, meaning that more than being anti-Semitic for religious reasons, it was for political reasons, because in its conception of the state, there was no room for any religion other than Catholicism. So, well, the difference is absolutely doctrinal. There is an initial connection, I repeat, in the early years when Falange and the Johns merged, but later on they really ended up separating, and today Falange is not a fascist party. In fact, in my opinion, today, fascism does not exist in Spain. The fact that fascism does not exist in Spain, to anticipate some comments, does not mean that there aren't people who identify themselves with fascism. Of course, those are different things. Sure, but I mean, it's structurally gone. Yes, for example, Vox. It's not a fascist party. How do you describe Vox's ideology? Vox is a conservative party. I think it's a conservative party, which, by the way, has undergone changes in recent years. A change in its economic policy. RUBÉN Manso Olivar said, RUBÉN Manso Olivar was one of the masterminds behind the first economic program that Vox presented in the 2018 elections I remembered. 2019, a program that, by the way, was praised by Juan Ramón Rayo, which already lets us know that it was a clearly liberal program. Indeed, right? That program changes quite a bit compared to the new economic program that Vox has now, because Vox's direction is also changing, right? Just so we get an idea, it's always been said that Vox is divided into two wings, the conservative wing and the liberal wing. Exactly. And in that internal struggle, in that decision that existed within Vox, the conservative wing has been imposing itself more and more. If you look at the profiles of those who joined and left Vox, you can see a correlation with this idea. People like RUBÉN Manso Olivar, Iván Espinosa de los Monteros, and Víctor Sánchez del Real, who represented Vox's more liberal side, have left. And Carlos Quero has joined, who is someone that, well, has a relatively interventionist policy within the housing system and market, right? So Vox is that kind of party. Now then, Vox is not a fascist party, whether people like it or not. Why? Because fascism is, above all, a move beyond democracy. If you read Mussolini's doctrine of fascism, Mussolini talks about overcoming liberal democracies, which for him had led the West to absolute misery during the previous century, during the 19th century. And to overcome that initial form of democracy, what he does is create a system, a fascist doctrine, that goes beyond democracy. Vox is a party that was born under a democratic regime, and continues within a democratic regime, and it governs the regions it governs within a democratic regime, without changing the democratic system. A democratic party can never be a fascist party, because fascism is always in the stratosphere, always in a dimension far beyond democracy. When fascism is absorbed by democracy, it becomes a more totalitarian, interventionist, authoritarian, and conservative form of democracy, but still remains democracy. So, no. Saying that Vox is a fascist party shows absolute ignorance.
Well, to wrap things up, within your political philosophy, would you consider that the crime of treason should be applied many more times than it is today?
Well, you've said it very clearly. Yes, of course. There is indeed a crime of treason defined in our penal code, in Article 592, which is not used, it's not put into practice. Let's see. When a state sells its sovereignty, or gives up part of its sovereignty to a foreign nation without anything in return, or for partisan interest rather than the general interest, it is a betrayal of the homeland. And this needs to be brought into the public debate much more. I mean, we're still discovering what's behind these deals, these alleged shady deals of Zapatero with the former narco-dictatorship of Venezuela.
That former part is very debatable.
Well, it's debatable, with Venezuela. Let's just say Venezuela so we don't get into another debate, because if we do, we'll never finish the podcast. So I think we're still just seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think, look, this is a prediction I'm making just as a side note. I think most of the corruption will be exposed in Spain in 2027, when people won't have enough time to forget about the corruption that has existed, because there will be so little time left before the general elections. That's when I think we'll see absolutely everything we need to see. Beyond that, I think there should be investigations, regardless of whether Zapatero ends up being found guilty or not for the Servi Navarro case, the Plus Ultra case, or the Delcy case. Whether he ends up being guilty or not, I think what there definitely is a betrayal. Because when you act more in the interest of a foreign state or power than in those of your own country, you are giving in, you are betraying the idea of the nation. Another example is Mr. Alvarez, the Foreign Affairs Minister, right? Let's remember that in May 2021, 8,000 Maghrebis entered Ceuta in 48 hours. They entered due to a border relaxation policy, openly implemented by Mohammed VI. When they enter, at first there is uncertainty. To show how serious it was, the European Union and the United Nations had to step in and say intervention is always through soft law, because we already know that they are supranational organizations that, even though they seem to have coercive power, the only thing they use that power for is to undermine the sovereignty of nations, not to intervene when they really need to. They said a mutual agreement is needed, or that Morocco and Spain should improve relations, since Moroccan and Ceuta borders are also European borders. In short, a huge mess, right? After those 8,000 Moroccans arrived in Ceuta in 48 hours because Mohammed VI eased border controls, a few months later, less than a year later, we had the foreign minister recognizing the Moroccan autonomy plan over Western Sahara. That's treason. That's exactly what is defined in Article 592 of the Penal Code. The thing is, it's not investigated. Yes, I think this debate is important, but as I said, we must recognize that some people, states and organizations seek to erase national identities. And those people, states and organizations, whenever Spain has judicial authority to prosecute them, must be tried for the crime of treason without any doubt.
RUBÉN, it's been a great pleasure having you here. I'd like us to end this program with you saying something to the audience.
Well, look, I'm mainly speaking to young people because they're the ones I can relate to most because of my age. I think it's a really bad time to believe the first thing we're told. If this were the case, if we had to believe whatever we're told first, then we'd have to assume that 90% of immigration comes from Mali, like Sara Santablaya said, or we'd have to assume that the number of false reports is 0.01% like they've told you so many times. Look, I'm never ever going to ask anyone to think exactly the same way I do. You may agree with part of my speech, or you may completely disagree with everything I say. What I ask is that you have critical thinking, real critical thinking, and analytical ability to see if the person in front of you is a fraud or someone who truly wants to build a better nation. Only then do I believe we will improve as individuals and as a nation.
Amazing, RUBÉN. It's been a real pleasure having you here. I've truly enjoyed it. We'll talk about more things because I think there are many topics we can cover, many debates we can organize, and it's been a real pleasure having your presence on social media. I already told you, absolute MVP of this past quarter. Keep it up, and above all, keep educating a lot of people, including me, because honestly, academic rigor is extremely important in these kinds of topics. Gentlemen, it has been a great pleasure to be here with you today. See you in the next episode of La Factoria.